So, what I want to do this evening is just to talk briefly about the assumptions, the key assumptions and attitudes that are contained within the orthodox economic models, what mainstream economists take for granted, and compare that with the values and attitudes that are there within the model that Kate Raworth is developing, donut economics. And as you'll see, I think that this has quite a lot of relevance to what Buddhism tells us about human nature and how we can work on ourselves. So, recently, there was after Kate Raworth's book was published, there was an economist called Branko Milanovic wrote a critique of the book from an orthodox economic viewpoint. And I think there was a bit of dialogue between them. And she produced a summary of the key differences in the two approaches, her approach and the approach of Branko Milanovic, representing orthodox economics. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm just going to read you through the 5 basic assumptions that are there in Branko Milanovic's approach to the world's problems, and the 5 basic assumptions that are there in Kate Raworth's approach. And then I'm going to try and explore 1 or 2 of them in a little bit more detail. So I think this is might be Kate Raworth's sort of summing up of Branko Milanovic's approach, which is today's uber capitalism demands maximum growth. That's the basic approach. So what does Branko Milanovic argue? He argues, first of all, people are naturally greedy, insatiable, and competitive. People are naturally greedy, insatiable, and competitive. The metric of success that informs people's lives and the way that our economy works, the metric of success is money, and everyone wants more of it. And this cannot be changed in the foreseeable future. So this is what we're stuck with. People are greedy, insatiable, and competitive. The metric of success is money, and everyone wants more of it. Because of this, pursuing well-being means that we must maximize the growth in gross domestic product, in GDP. This is what we were looking at this morning. We must maximize growth in GDP. He recognizes there is a problem with the environment, but he says achieving this maximum growth in GDP depends upon overcoming environmental limits to growth. And the way to do this is through technology. We can depend upon technology to come up with the solutions to any of the problems that we face with environmental limits. So it's a very useful summary of this, because basically this outlines, I think, many of the key assumptions that lie behind most economists' approach to what's happening in our world today. Now, Kate Raworth's approach, she sums up with this phrase, tomorrow's thriving future must be growth agnostic. In other words, saying, well, there may be growth, there may not be. It doesn't matter. We need to be agnostic in relation to growth. That compares with Milanovic's today's uber capitalism demands maximum growth. So what of her assumptions? Remember, Milanovic said people are greedy, insatiable, and competitive. She says people are greedy and generous. competitive and collaborative. And it's possible to nurture human nature. So she's saying people are both greedy and generous, competitive and collaborative, and we can nurture human nature in the direction that we wish to see it go. I'm going to come back to that because this is the key area in terms of understanding, I think, what's wrong with current economics. Milanovic said the metric of success is money and everyone wants more of it. For Kate Raworth, the metric of success is to meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. So it's a very different approach. Instead of just seeking more money and wanting more of money, the metric of success is to meet the needs of all living beings on the planet within the means of the planet. And this is what she calls getting into the donut. If you remember that space, the donut space. Milanovic says you cannot change the fact that people are greedy, insatiable and competitive. You cannot change the metric of success being money and that everyone wants more of it. It's not possible to change it. Raworth says the metric of success is to meet the needs of all within the means of the planet, and this is essential for humanity's common future. If we can't do that, we risk the future of humanity. So for her then, instead of pursuing well-being through maximising gross domestic product, maximising growth, she says we should pursue well-being through what she describes as distributive and regenerative economies. In other words, we seek to have the right kind of economies that will meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. And that may mean, in some cases, GDP increasing, it may mean GDP reducing. But that's a consequence of seeking to meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. So a very different approach to well-being. And so achieving this, according to Kate Raworth, depends upon overcoming today's financial, political and social addiction to GDP growth. There's no question about it. She's highlighting something very important here. All politicians, all financiers and so on are hooked on GDP growth. And we have to find a way to overcome the addiction to seeking growth. And she says this is by no means easy, but it can be done. So that's a very different concluding approach to the approach of Milanovic, which is that we must seek more GDP growth, maximise it. The environmental issues are a problem, but we know that technology can find a resolution to those problems. So two very stark, contrasting models. And at the heart of it are the assumptions about human nature. So for Milanovic, people are greedy, insatiable, and competitive. For Kate Raworth, people are greedy and generous, competitive and collaborative. So this is very interesting, I think. Are we as human beings naturally greedy? Is it something that we're born with and we can't change? Is it something that we need to worry about, or is it something that's good? Now, it might seem a bit odd to ask a question, is there something good about greed? But of course, according to modern capitalism, greed is great. Who's seen the film Wall Street with Michael Douglas? Some of you seen it? Yeah. Where he plays a character called Gordon Gekko. Gordon Gekko. Anyway, there's a background to this. The character of Gordon Gekko in the Wall Street film was based upon, in part, on a real life character, a man called Ivan Bursky, who was a real life Wall Street trader. He traded on Wall Street and made a fortune trading in stocks and shares. And in May 1986, Ivan Bursky was invited to the University of California Berkeley School of Business to give what's called the commencement ceremony address. He was a really hugely successful and famous Wall Street trader. So you have all these business studies alumni, all these various business studies students, lecturers, professors, and so on there. And in that talk he said, greed is all right, by the way. I want you to know that. I think greed is healthy. You can be greedy and still feel good about yourself. And a journalist who was there wrote a report of the talk, and he said, everybody in the audience laughed and applauded at that point. This particular sort of episode was taken up later in the Wall Street film Gordon Gekko. But just as an aside, later in 1986, Ivan Bursky went to jail because he had been so greedy. He had amassed a lot of his wealth through illegal trading. And there is actually quite a lot of evidence that the encouragement of greed in the economic world leads to corruption and illegal activity. But anyhow, his words lived on the following year in the film Wall Street with this character Gordon Gekko. What's happening is Gordon Gekko is addressing a group of shareholders. He wants to take over a company, and he's trying to persuade a majority of the shareholders to support his takeover. So he's giving this talk, and this is what he says. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms. Greed for life, greed for money, greed for love, greed for knowledge has marked the upward surge of mankind. I'm quoting him directly there. I wouldn't normally use the word mankind there, but that's his words. Marked the upward surge of mankind. And there's another quote I'd like to read you from 2013. Boris Johnson, then Mayor of London. And when I wrote this book, leading British Conservative politician, now Foreign Minister, isn't he? Foreign Secretary. He declared that inequality is essential to fostering the spirit of envy. So he believes that the greater the degree of inequality, the better this is, because it encourages people to feel envy and therefore motivates them. And he hailed greed as, quote, a valuable spur to economic activity, and he called upon the Gordon Gekkos of London to display their greed in order to promote economic growth. And it's not just Boris Johnson and Branko Milanovic and others. You find that this assumption that greed is the natural state of the human being. When you look at the teachings of the Buddha, I find this quite interesting because sometimes you read Buddhists who say human beings are naturally good, are naturally generous, full stop. So it's the opposite of what Branko Milanovic is saying, that human beings are naturally greedy. When you look at the Buddha's teachings, the early teachings contained within the Pali Canon, the earliest recording teachings of the Buddha, what the Buddha says is very interesting. He identifies the root problem for humanity is that we can very easily be governed by greed, by hatred, and by delusion. This is what he describes as the three root poisons. It's almost as if we are born with these tendencies towards greed, towards hatred, and towards delusion. In evolutionary terms, you could think about it that we are born with the tendency for greed and hatred because, when species were developing in the past, if there was food available, you had to grab it quickly. And you had to fight off anybody else. In other words, you kind of hated anybody else trying to get to that food because your survival depended upon it. So we are born with survival instincts, the potential for greed and hatred, and we're deluded because we don't know the true nature of ourselves, the true nature of the world around us. But, he said, and this is the important thing, we do have the potential for greed, hatred, and delusion, but we equally have the potential for generosity, for kindness, and for wisdom. So we have within us competing potentials. And which of those potentials wins out depends upon which of them we feed, which of them dominate our mind. There's a phrase from the Buddha, what the mind dwells upon, that we become. What the mind dwells upon, that we become. So if we dwell upon wanting more things and so on, that's what we will become. If we dwell upon becoming more generous and kind and so on, that we become. In other words, human nature can be developed. It's up to us to develop whichever of the potentials within us we want to develop. Very important, this. In evolutionary terms, of course there are these competing potentials. Charles Darwin, is known for his work on evolution. And it's often thought that he simply said that human beings are greedy, will compete with each other and so on. And that's how we have developed to where we are now. But actually, he said a lot more than that. He wrote some interesting stuff in a book called The Descent of Man, where he said, those groups of humans that develop the capacity for cooperation and working together were more successful than those groups that had less ability to cooperate and collaborate. Those groups that were more successful with collaboration and cooperation had more children who survived. And in a way, he says, therefore, there is this competing evolutionary tendency within us. At the level of the individuals, there is this tendency for us to compete with each other. But at the level of groups, what makes the difference in evolutionary terms is the ability to cooperate and collaborate. Actually, it's quite alarming when you realise what's really being said here, because the competition between groups, of course, was quite tribal and involved war and violence. So it's almost like what happened was that because of that violent competition between groups, within groups, different tendencies began to operate, the tendency for cooperation and collaboration. And I think that when you look at the teachings of the Buddha, it's very interesting to contemplate why did the Buddha come up with his teachings about greed versus generosity, hatred versus kindness, and so on. What was going on at that particular period of time? And there is a philosopher called Karl Jaspers who's written about this period from about 800 BCE through to about 200 BCE. He calls it the Axial Age. And he calls it the Axial Age because during that period, in different parts of the world, there emerged new thinkers and new teachers. So you had the Greek philosophers. You had Taoism and Confucius and so on in China. You had the Buddha in India. You had the Hebrew prophets and so on. And when you look at what's common across them what's common is an emphasis on the need for compassion and kindness and the need to extend compassion and kindness beyond your immediate tribe. So when you read the Buddha, you get a sense of the environment, the society in which he moved. There were quite a lot of wars going on between the different republics and kingdoms and so on. But basically there's a recognition happening, almost a realization, that humanity has developed so far, and there's a degree of cooperation and collaboration there within us which can be nurtured, but it has to be able to move beyond our immediate tribe to the wider world. So when we were looking at, and I read yesterday, the Metta Sutta, he talked about both near and far, born already, living now, or to be born in the future, widening the circle of kindness and compassion. So what you can take from the Buddha and the other teachers of the Axial Age is that we are alive at a critical time. Can humanity overcome the limitations of tribalism, if you like? Can we overcome the restricted vision of who we should be kind to, who we should cooperate with, and expand that vision to the world as a whole? So I think that all of the key debates that we have about how our economy works or should work can come down to this discussion about the nature of human nature. What is it that makes us human? How can we work to develop ourselves better for the future? And this is where Buddhism has a lot to offer. So we practice metta. We practice encouraging, widening the sphere of kindness. It's very interesting, when the Buddha practiced metta, and we do it with a method that comes from Buddhaghosa. I can't remember what century, was it 5th century? Something like that. Wrote down a manual on meditation and Buddhism in the 5th century in Sri Lanka. So we have this like 4 or 5 stage part of Metta Bhavana. The Buddha would cultivate kindness within himself and would sit and would radiate kindness to the north in front of him, say, to the south behind him, to the east, to the west, above him, below him, all around. And he would just sit and radiate kindness in all directions. That was his practice, one of his practices. Quite extraordinary, actually, very simple. And in a way, what we are doing when we practice the Metta Bhavana is we're using different tools and techniques to try and tap into and awake within ourselves the simplicity of that approach, so that we radiate kindness and openness to the world around us. Kindness is critical to the future of the world, the future of our economy. And maybe we will make it, and maybe we won't make it. I think it's that important. Okay.